All right, welcome to the PHP Project Training Series tutorials. Building a PHP Hit Counter Part 2. In Part 2 of the tutorial series, we'll build our PHP script, which will read and record the hits received on the home page of the website that we had built in Part 1 of the tutorial series. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's get into our file and let's build that PHP file. Alright, so as within all the tutorials that we build on the OnTarget HTML5 site, we want to make certain that our web server is up and running. So let's go ahead and bring up that XAMPP control panel or your WAMP control panel, whichever one you happen to be using, and make certain that we've got our Apache server started and the MySQL portion of the server is also started, which enables the PHP. Very important for this particular tutorial because we're actually going to be writing the PHP script now. We'll need that portion of the web server up and functioning so we know whether or not our script is operating correctly. All right, so we've got our web server up and running. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. Let's go ahead and open up our browser. So we're actually in our local host now where we've got all the files that we created in the first portion of the tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and open up my text editor, my Sublime Text 2, which is the text editor that I'm using, my text editor of choice. Obviously, you can use whichever text editor you prefer. And I'm going to open up my code snippets from the exercise files. If you've purchased the tutorial, you'll have a copy of the code snippets inside the file that you downloaded. And if not, you'll have plenty of time to pause the tutorial as we go through this and type this in. I'm going to go ahead and grab the PHP counter code that we have there, Control-C to copy. I'm going to get into my text editor, and I'm going to paste this into my text editor. I'm going to do a save as. I want to save this in the scripts directory of our web root. So I'm going to call this counter.php. This will actually be the PHP file that we're going to call that's actually going to go in. And if you remember from the previous tutorial, we created a flat text file called count.txt inside of our scripts directory. That's where we're actually going to store these counts for our website as we go through and do this. I'm going to go back to that parent directory. So let's real quickly talk about this file that we just put into our text editor. This would be a great time, by the way, let me go ahead and do a word wrap. This would be a great time, by the way, for you to pause this tutorial if you want to go ahead and type this text into your text editor for your PHP code. Remember, we want to save this as counter.php. All right, so I've assumed that you got everything typed in. So let's real quickly talk about this PHP file that we've just created. First thing we do is on line 1, we're creating a variable called file. And in that variable, we're going into the scripts directory, which is right here. This is the directory that we created on our web server, and we're loading the count.txt file. That's that flat text file that we created in the previous tutorial. It's part 1 of this tutorial series. So we're actually loading up whatever values in that count text file. Then I'm creating another variable called name, and I'm using a built-in function in PHP called fopen. And you're going to see in a minute, we're going to talk about all these built-in functions that we're using in this tutorial in a slide in a moment. So I'm going to bring up this fopen function. I'm going to load in the file that we just read, the count.txt file, and I'm going to open that up as reading only. So I'm going to read from that file. I'm going to create another variable called hits. I'm going to trim out all the white space from that file that we just opened. Then I'm going to use what's called the fgets built-in function in PHP, which is going to read an individual line of, again, the file that we just opened. I'm going to take that line and I'm going to add 1 to it. And then I'm going to use another built-in function in PHP called fclose, and I'm going to close that file. And again, you'll notice that we've given that file name a variable called name. We're going to close the file out. Then right below that, I'm going to create variable name once again. I'm going to open up that file again, but this time I'm going to open it up to write. So I'm going to write back to it. And that's what this attribute W is. We had the read attribute and we have the write attribute. And again, we're going to talk about these built-in functions in a moment. But I'm going to open up that file in a write capability. I'm going to write, using the file name, the value of hits. Remember, we took the hits from that file and we added 1 to it. We're going to take that value back and write it back into that file. So for instance, if that value when we read it was 2, and we've added 1 to it. Now we're going to write it back as 3. And then once again, we're going to close that file name so it's closed out. We've closed all the pointers that we've opened up, and we've set it back to the way it was inside the flat text file. And then I'm going to echo the value of hits. Hits, remember, is the variable that we created up top that's storing that number. I'm going to echo, and echo is basically a print command in PHP. It's very similar to print. It echoes the value of whatever we have behind it to the right of it onto the screen of our browser. So I'm going to echo whatever the value of hits is back to the browser window. And you're going to see how we pull that out of the PHP file to display in the browser window in a minute once we get into that portion. Okay, so that's a really brief description of the counter.php file. Now let's go back to our presentation for a moment. Let's talk about these built-in functions that we used in this tutorial. Okay, so we've got our files created. Now let's go back to our presentation. Keep in mind we've saved our counter.php file into our scripts directory. It resides in the same directory as the count, or the flat text file that we created in the previous tutorial, count.txt. All right, so let's go back to our presentation and talk about these variables, or these built-in functions that we just created. So PHP has built-in functions, and the ones that it has quite a few built-in functions actually, and you're going to see them as you go through the tutorials on the website. We're going to use a lot of the built-in functions in PHP, but let's talk about the ones we used in this particular portion of this tutorial. We used a built-in function called fopen. And fopen opens a file or a URL, and it sets the file pointer. The common attributes that are used with fopen are R for read, W for write, and A for append. And you're going to see throughout a lot of the tutorials that we use on the site, we use fopen quite a bit in PHP, not only in the website, but also in real life. I mean, fopen is a very, very popular function of PHP. Another one that we used inside the tutorial was called trim. And trim strips white space out of the return, white space or other characters. You can actually designate what other characters, and I'll show you that in a minute, from the beginning and ending of a string so that we have nothing but the value of the string itself. Another function that we used fgets. And fgets gets a line from the file pointer. It's not real important in this particular tutorial because we only have one line in this file, as you're going to see in a few minutes. But the file pointer must be valid and must point to a file opened successfully by the fopen command. So you'll notice that fgets and fopen kind of work together. And you're going to see that we have another one here in a minute that does the same thing. They work together as two built-in functions of PHP. And fclose closes an open file pointer. The file pointer must be valid and must point to a file opened successfully by fopen. And you'll notice that inside these parentheses, when we were actually going back and forth inside of our tutorial, hang on, let's go down for 1 second and look. You'll notice that inside the parentheses, we were putting the name of the file and the attributes that we were looking at. For instance, when we opened up the fopen, it asked, what are we opening? We're opening this file, which we designated the variable. Remember, this variable holds that scripts count.txt. The path to the file is stored in that file variable. Fopen is going in and opening that file, and it's opening it with the attribute of R for reading. Same thing with trim. When we use that trim command to get rid of all the white space, remember, we're telling trim, first off, fgets grab the line from this file. Remember, this name now is storing the file in a capability of reading. So I want you to get the line from that file, and I want you to trim all the white space out of it. Something to remember when you're dealing with programming, you always work from the right to left. So on a programming line, we want to work in, and the first thing we're going to do here, we're going to perform the fgets on the file that we've given here. Then we're going to perform the trim on the return of fgets, and then we're going to assign all of that to the variable hits. So you're working from the right to the left. And that's true with almost all programming languages. You're going to work from the right to the left and step it one step at a time. So basically we have two built-in functions here. We're performing one, then once we get the value of that one, we're performing the next on that value. All right. So we've talked about the built-in functions that we used in PHP for this particular tutorial. The next thing we're going to do, let's talk about this fwrite. And the fwrite function writes the contents of a string to the file stream pointed to by the handle. The handle is a file system resource that's typically created using the fopen function. So again, using this fopen function, we opened up that file, we have this pointer assigned to it, and inside of our program, if you remember, we're actually using that fwrite command to take the file and increment the hits. Remember up here we added 1 to the value of hits. Whatever we read in, we added 1 to it. Now we're writing that value back to that flat text file. And then we're closing the file out. One thing I want to talk about before we move forward is to get additional information on any of the functions you see on any of the tutorials that are on the website, you can actually go to this URL link, us3.php.net/docs.php. This is the actual documentation site for PHP. And I'm actually on the documentation tab right now. I'm going to select English. And just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, you can actually search the documentation. Let's look at that trim function, because if you remember, when we talked about the trim function, we said it trims white space and additional characters. So if we go look at the trim function, it actually tells you how to set this function up to actually strip white space or other characters from the beginning and ending of a string. And if you wanted to strip other characters, and you'll see that in some of the future tutorials on the website, we're actually going to use a lot of these functions that are built into PHP, but it actually shows you how it's set up. That we're designating the string that we're working on, then we have a comma, and we designate a character list if we're actually trying to strip out additional characters. If we're just stripping out white space, we basically just set up the string, the trim function, and then set the variable that contains the string inside the parentheses. One of the other ones I wanted to look at really quick, just so you get an idea of the availability of the documentation and how good, because the documentation actually is very good on this site, is the fopen command. Remember we talked about it has attributes for reading, writing, and appending. It actually has additional attributes that you can look at, and if you scroll down on the fopen, you'll actually see a complete attribute list of the attributes that are available. Remember we talked about R was for reading, open for reading only, place the file pointer at the beginning of the file. So it's opening the file, it places the pointer at the very beginning of the file, and it's for read only. W is for writing only. Place the file pointer at the beginning of the file and open the file for writing only. So, and we're going to talk about another one later on in future tutorials. We'll use appending a lot as we work on databases. We'll actually append data to a file. So the documentation is really, really good on the PHP website. Again, you can go to us3.php.net/doc, and that will bring you to the PHP documentation to get any additional information that you need on any of the functions that we use in our tutorials. So let's add the PHP to our actual web page to call the application that we just created from the index page to actually increment that counter. Let me show you how that's done. All right, so let me go ahead and close out the presentation for a minute. I want to open up my index.php page, so we're going to go back here to our PHP Hit Counter. Let's open up that _index file. Move this one as my primary. What I want to do now is I want to be able to call that application that we just wrote in our scripts directory from this page so that we can get a count for that particular file. So I'm going to go ahead and use my code snippets once again. Again, if you've purchased this tutorial, you'll have this in the exercise files folder. If not, we'll pause so that you can type it in. I'm going to copy this line of code. And then right below where I have my paragraph text, I'm going to paste this into my browser window. Let's go ahead and do this word wrap so that you can type this stuff in if you need to. And what I'm doing with this line of code, first off, it's the first time that we've used in this particular tutorial, at least, where we've actually intermixed HTML5 and PHP. You'll notice here that I've got a standard paragraph tag, and it says this page has received, and then I drop out of HTML. I'm calling PHP using an include function, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'm giving it the absolute path to that counter.php file. It's in our scripts directory, and the name of the file. Putting a semicolon at the end of my PHP because it's required with our PHP. And if you've taken the Essential series, you'll understand how PHP code is written. So I'm ending that statement with my semicolon. I'm closing out my PHP with that question mark greater than sign, and then I'm putting down hits, period, and then closing out the paragraph tag. So what I've done here is I've actually encapsulated PHP inside of an HTML paragraph tag. And what it's going to do, if you remember right from our code, I'm echoing back hits. Remember I told you echo is like a print statement. It prints whatever the value is of this variable into our screen. So in my index.php file, none of this is going to show up when I view my source. All I'm going to see is the value of that variable hits as it comes in, and you'll see that in a minute. Let's go ahead and save this file, because again, we've got to save all our files before they're going to take effect. And then I'm going to want to load my index.php page, and you'll see that right now I've got this page has received 1 hit. So it's the very first time that this page has been viewed since we incorporated this string. If I come to page 2 and I come back into page 1, or the home page, and notice now it says 2 hits. So every time, and if I were to refresh this, it will actually go up also. Every time we make a call to the web server to view this page, it's going to increment that value, that hits value, or the time that that's been viewed. So again, every time we make a call to the web server to serve this page up, that PHP script is going to run, and it's going to increment that value based on the fact that we told it, look, I want you to read the value that's there, remember? Read this value and then add 1 to it. So whatever value is currently stored in that flat text file, it's going to read the value and add 1 to it. If I were to go into our web host, and in fact, let's do that. Let's go back into our web server and let's actually call up. Remember that count.txt file that had no values in it? Let's actually open that file and see what value we have in there. And you'll notice we got the number 5. So every time I bring that up, let's go back into our parent directory. Let's bring up our index.php file. You notice it says 6 now. If I were to go in here and refresh, look, it says 6. If I were to go back to the home page and refresh this, it says 7. So we're reading this value into that script by using that PHP code. This code is running. It's grabbing the value from that flat text file and it's displaying it on our page. Okay, so that's pretty cool. I mean, we've actually written now a PHP file. We've written this PHP file that's being loaded every time that we call that home page or our index.php page from the server, and it's incrementing a value inside that flat text file to show us how many times that web page has been served up from the server to a browser window. Cool, but you know what? It's not really efficient. If I were to take that same code, let's take our index.php code and let's copy this paragraph. So let's Control C. I want to go ahead and open up page 1, and I'm going to show you one of the problems with this particular script. On page 1, I'm going to go ahead and add this below our paragraph tags, just like we did on the, let me go ahead and do that word wrap so you can see this if you want to type it in. But this is just like we had done this on our index page. I'm going to go ahead and save all of our files. And here's where the shortcoming is of this particular script. Okay, so we've got our web page up. I'm looking here at the home page. I've got 8. If I go to page 1, it says 9. Wait a minute. If I go to the home page, it says 10. So what it's doing is the script doesn't know how to distinguish between the pages. It's giving me the total hits to the home page regardless of where I input that PHP call or that PHP include function. So that's a shortcoming in this script. So this text file is only storing the total number of hits, whether it's a total number of hits on the index page or the total number of hits on the page 1 page. It just stores the total. It doesn't know how many hits each individual page is received. And that's important as a web developer. Understanding where you have the majority of your traffic on your website tells you how to focus your development, or tells you where to focus your energies at. Because if this area of the website's much more popular than the other one, then you obviously want to focus your energy where the most popularity is. That's what's going to build your traffic. So what we want to do is we want to actually modify this PHP file so it can not only track the total number of hits to the website, but also the hits to each individual page. So before we do that, let's go back in real quick and talk about that include function, because that's one of the built-in functions that we just added to our website, which we haven't talked about yet. Let's talk about this function, and then we'll move on. All right, so we added another function to our PHP file, and that was called the include function, another built-in function of PHP. And what include does is the include statement includes and evaluates the specified file. So if you remember from our call, we told include, go to this directory, load this PHP script, and I want you to run that script. So I want you to perform whatever this PHP function, or whatever this PHP application is telling you to do. When I include it inside here, I want you to go ahead and run it. So by including it, I'm actually running this script and I'm echoing back or printing back the value of echo into the variable that I assigned hits, and that's actually displaying that on the page right there. That's what we're echoing back. That's all we're seeing from that PHP call right here. When we actually include this, all we're getting back is this, but because it's PHP, it has to be enclosed in these PHP tags. The opening tag and the closing tag are telling it what to do and then give me back that value of 12, or in this case 13, 14, or whatever. So that's what the include function does. So in part 3 of the tutorial series, we will create a more advanced PHP file that will count the hits associated with each individual page of our website. So not only can we track the total hits for the index page, which is the home page of the website, but we're going to be able to track the individual hits to each individual page of the website. And that's much more functional than what we currently have. I mean, it's cool that we've written this cute little PHP file to go and grab the hits from the index page, but now let's make it much more functional so we can look at each individual page of the website itself. I'll see you in the next tutorial.